The candles in the ballroom went out all at once, and for a moment, 300 people stood in complete darkness, holding their breath. Elena Marsh froze near the tall window, a bundle of silk pressed against her chest, her heart slamming so hard she could hear it in her own ears. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in the servants' passage, delivering a torn gown to Lady Whitmore before anyone noticed the rip. Instead, a careless footman had shoved her through the wrong door, and now she stood in the middle of the grandest room she had ever seen, surrounded by strangers dressed in silk and jewels, while the candles died and a woman somewhere screamed. Someone shouted for the servants to relight the flames. Feet shuffled, a glass shattered, and in that space of darkness and confusion, a hand closed firmly around Elena's wrist. "Don't move," a low voice said near her ear. "There's a man near the east door with a knife, and I don't think he came here for the wine." Elena's breath caught. She did not know this voice, did not know the face it belonged to, but something about its calm control made her stay perfectly still instead of screaming. The grip on her wrist was strong but not cruel, steady, in a room full of panic. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who would rather you stayed alive tonight," the voice answered. "Now, walk with me, slowly, toward the light by the far column. Smile if anyone looks at you. Do not run." She had no reason to trust a stranger in the dark, and yet her feet moved before her mind could argue. He guided her firmly through the crowd, one hand at the small of her back, weaving between panicked guests, as if he could see clearly even in the blackness. When the candles flared back to life a few seconds later, gasps rippled through the ballroom, followed by nervous laughter as people realized nothing worse had happened than a servant knocking over a chandelier rope. But Elena saw what the others missed. Near the east door, a man in a dark coat was being quietly restrained by two guards, a blade wrestled from his hand, before he could reach the small stage where the host stood. Whoever the man beside her was, he had known exactly where danger was coming from, before anyone else in the room noticed it. She turned to look at him properly for the first time, and her breath caught again, this time for an entirely different reason. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat that fit him as if it had been made for no other man in the world. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair slightly disturbed from the commotion, and his eyes, a deep gray blue, were fixed on her, with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of the plain gray dress she wore beneath her cloak, so different from the silks and satins around them. "You're bleeding," he said suddenly, nodding toward her hand. She looked down. In the chaos, she had gripped the bundle of silk so tightly that a hidden pin had cut into her palm. A thin line of red traced across her skin. "It's nothing," she said quickly, hiding her hand behind the fabric. "It's something," he said, and before she could protest, he had produced a clean handkerchief from his coat and was wrapping it gently around her palm. His hands were warm and sure, and up close, she noticed a small crest embroidered in silver thread on the corner of the cloth. A crest she recognized from carriages that occasionally passed through the poorer streets of the city, always too fast, always too far above the people who watched them go by. "You're the Duke," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Something flickered across his face, amusement mixed with something else. "Alistair Rutherford," he said simply, as if his title did not matter half as much as his name. "And you are?" "Elena," she said. "Elena Marsh. I work for a seamstress. I wasn't meant to be in this room at all." "Then it seems fate had other plans," he said, tying off the handkerchief with a small, careful knot. Before she could answer, a group of nobles descended upon them, drawn by the drama of the evening, and eager for a piece of gossip to carry home. A woman in emerald silk fanned herself dramatically and asked the Duke if he had truly disarmed the intruder with his bare hands, while a young lord asked if it was true a man had tried to attack the host over a gambling debt. Alistair answered smoothly, deflecting the questions with practiced charm, but Elena noticed his eyes kept drifting back to her, as if checking that she was still there, still safe. She should have left. She should have slipped away into the crowd and returned to her work in the back room, where she belonged. But something rooted her in place, some strange pull she could not name, and she found herself standing quietly, at the edge of the circle of nobles, watching the Duke navigate their questions, with an ease that spoke of years of practice, hiding his true thoughts behind polite words. "And who is this?" asked Lady Priscilla Hartwell, stepping forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She was strikingly beautiful, dressed in deep sapphire blue, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate crown of curls. Her gaze swept over Elena's simple gray dress with obvious disdain. "I don't believe I've seen you at any of the recent gatherings, my dear. Whose household do you belong to?" The question was designed to humiliate, to remind Elena of exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of this glittering room. Elena felt her cheeks warm, and for a moment, words failed her entirely. It was Alistair who answered, and what he said would echo through her mind for weeks afterward. "She is my wife," he said, so casually that for a heartbeat, no one in the small circle seemed to register the words at all. Then the silence broke into a wave of gasps and murmurs. Lady Priscilla's smile froze on her face. The young lord who had asked about the intruder nearly dropped his glass. Even the musicians, who had just begun playing again near the far wall, seemed to falter for half a note. "Your wife?" Lady Priscilla repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Since when does the Duke of Ashford have a wife?" "There has been no announcement, no ceremony spoken of in any circle I know of. We prefer to keep some things private," Alistair said smoothly, though Elena could see the faintest curve of amusement at the corner of his mouth, as if he were testing how far the lie could travel before it collapsed. Elena's mind raced. She should correct him immediately, should explain that this was some kind of mistake or a strange joke that had gone too far. But the weight of every eye in the circle pressing down on her, the shock of being addressed as though she belonged in this world of silk and titles, made her voice catch in her throat. Instead, without meaning to, without any thought at all, a whisper escaped her lips, meant only for herself. "I wish that were true." She did not realize she had said it aloud until she saw Alistair's eyes widen slightly, just for a moment, before his expression smoothed back into careless charm. But he had heard her. She was certain of it. Heat flooded her face, and she wanted nothing more than for the marble floor to open and swallow her whole. "If you'll excuse us," Alistair said smoothly to the gathered nobles, "my wife and I have matters to discuss." He extended his arm, and though every instinct told Elena to refuse, to flee, to disappear into the safety of the servants' passage where she belonged, she found herself placing her hand on his arm instead, allowing him to lead her away from the circle of curious eyes. They walked in silence, past the dance floor, past clusters of nobles who turned to whisper as they passed, until they reached a quiet alcove near tall glass doors that opened onto a moonlit garden. Only then did Alistair release her arm and turn to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "I owe you an apology," he said. "That was unfair of me, to use you as a shield without asking." "A shield," Elena repeated, still trying to steady her racing heart. "What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the ballroom where Lady Priscilla stood watching them with narrowed eyes. "There are certain arrangements being pushed upon me by my family, marriages meant to secure alliances rather than any kind of genuine affection. Lady Priscilla has made her intentions known rather forcefully in recent months. Claiming to have a wife seemed, in that moment, like the fastest way to end the conversation. So I was simply convenient," Elena said, unable to hide the sting in her voice. "A prop to use and discard." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. And for the first time since she had met him, he seemed almost unsure of himself. "You saved me from having to decide anything tonight. I should be thanking you, not the other way around." Elena crossed her arms, though the gesture felt strange, in a dress that was not her own social class to wear so confidently. "And what happens now? Half that ballroom believes I am your wife. By morning, the story will have traveled to every household in the city." "I'll correct it," he said. "I'll tell them it was a joke, poorly made in the heat of the moment." "And what of what I said?" Elena asked before she could stop herself, immediately regretting the question the moment it left her lips. Alistair's gaze softened, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, as though trying to solve some puzzle he had not expected to encounter that evening. "I heard you," he admitted quietly, "and I confess, I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." Elena's heart pounded in a way that had nothing to do with the earlier danger in the ballroom. She opened her mouth to explain, to dismiss her own words as nothing more than embarrassment speaking without permission. But before she could find the right words, a commotion arose behind them, near the entrance of the garden doors. 2 guards were escorting the captured intruder past the alcove, his hands bound, his face twisted with anger. As he passed, his eyes locked onto Alistair with a look of pure hatred, and he called out words that made Elena's blood run cold. "This isn't over, Rutherford. Your father took everything from my family, and I will make sure you lose everything that matters to you, starting with whatever secret you're hiding behind that garden door." The guards pulled him away before he could say more, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Alistair's jaw tightened, his easy charm vanishing entirely, replaced by something harder, more guarded. "Who was that?" Elena asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "A man with old grievances and very little patience," Alistair said grimly. "I did not expect him to notice you standing here." "Notice me? Why would that matter?" Alistair turned to her, his expression suddenly serious, in a way that made the earlier teasing moments in the ballroom feel like a different lifetime altogether. "Because he just heard me call you my wife, and men like him do not forget details like that. If he believes hurting you would hurt me, Elena, you may have just become a target simply by standing beside me tonight." The words settled over her like a cold weight, and for the first time since stepping through the wrong door hours earlier, Elena understood that whatever strange story had begun tonight, in the flickering candlelight of a ballroom she never should have entered, was far from finished. It had only just begun, and there would be no simple way to walk away from it now. Somewhere behind them, the orchestra began a new song, bright and cheerful, utterly unaware of the danger unfolding just beyond the garden doors. Elena looked at the Duke standing before her, this stranger who had wrapped her wound with his own handkerchief, spoken words that made her heart race, and now stood between her and a threat she barely understood, and she realized, with a growing sense of unease, that her simple life, delivering gowns and mending hems, had changed completely the moment she walked through that door. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Alistair looked back toward the ballroom, then down at her, his expression a mixture of determination and something gentler, something that looked almost like protectiveness. "For tonight," he said, "you stay close to me. Tomorrow, we figure out exactly how deep this danger runs, and whether the words I said without thinking have just put both our lives in far more danger than either of us expected." Elena swallowed hard, glancing once more toward the garden doors, where the guards had disappeared with their prisoner, his threat still echoing in her mind. Whatever safety she had felt in her old, quiet life was gone now, replaced by an uncertain and new path she had never asked to walk. And yet, standing there in the moonlight, beside a man she had known for less than an hour, she felt an unexpected flicker of something else beneath the worry, a pull she could not explain, and did not entirely want to resist. The night was far from over, and neither, she suspected, was the story that had just begun between them. The carriage that carried Elena home that night was not her own. She had never ridden in anything so fine, with velvet seats and brass lanterns that swayed gently as the wheels rolled over cobblestones. Alistair sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the small window, watching the dark streets pass with the alertness of a man who expected trouble to appear at any moment. "You don't have to come with me," Elena said, breaking the silence. "I've walked these streets alone 100 times." "Not tonight," Alistair said firmly. "Not after what that man said." She studied him in the low lantern light, trying to understand this stranger who had turned her evening upside down. "Who is he?" "You called him by name, Rutherford," he said, like it meant something bitter to him. Alistair's jaw tightened. Gareth Voss. His family once held land bordering my own. Generations ago, there was a dispute over water rights that turned into something much larger, and by the time it ended, his father had lost everything, and mine had gained it. Gareth was a boy then. He is not a boy now, and he has spent years believing my family destroyed his out of greed rather than law. "Was it greed?" Elena asked. Alistair did not answer immediately. "I was young when it happened. I only know what I was told, and what I was told does not always match what I have since read in old letters my father kept. I cannot say the matter was as clean as I once believed." The honesty in his voice surprised her. She had expected excuses, the smooth deflections nobles were known for, not this quiet uncertainty. "That's a dangerous thing to admit to a stranger," she said. "You stopped being a stranger the moment I called you my wife in front of half the city," he said, and though his tone was light, there was something almost serious beneath it. The carriage slowed as it turned onto a narrower street, one lined with shuttered shops and dim lanterns hanging from crooked posts. Elena recognized the bakery on the corner, the cobbler's shop with its faded sign, and finally, her mother's small dress shop tucked between them. A single candle burning in the upstairs window, where Margaret Marsh waited for her daughter to return. "This is close enough," Elena said, reaching for the door handle. "Thank you, truly, for tonight. For the handkerchief, for walking me out safely. I think it's best if we simply forget the rest happened." "Elena," Alistair said, and something in his voice made her pause with her hand still on the handle. "I don't think forgetting is an option anymore." Before she could ask what he meant, the carriage lurched violently sideways, throwing her against the door. Outside, the horses screamed, and the driver shouted something she couldn't make out, over the sudden pounding of hooves against stone. Alistair moved instantly, pulling her away from the window, just as something struck the side of the carriage, with a sound like a fist against wood. "Stay down!" he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding, in a way it had not been all evening. Elena crouched low, her heart hammering, as the carriage rocked again. Through the small gap in the curtain, she caught a glimpse of two riders on dark horses flanking the carriage, their faces hidden beneath wide hoods. One of them carried something long and metallic that caught the moonlight. "They're trying to force us off the road," Alistair said grimly, reaching beneath his coat and producing a small pistol Elena had not known he carried. "Whatever happens, do not open that door." The driver shouted again, and the carriage surged forward with sudden, desperate speed, throwing Elena against the seat as the horses broke into a full gallop. The riders matched their pace, one pulling alongside the door, close enough that Elena could hear him shouting something to his companion over the thunder of hooves. "Voss sent them," Alistair said, more to himself than to her. His eyes narrowed as he watched through the gap in the curtain. "He works quickly." "What do they want?" Elena asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound steady. "To send a message," Alistair said, "that no one close to me is safe." The carriage swerved sharply as the driver took a corner too fast, and Elena heard a sharp crack, like a whip or perhaps something worse, followed by a cry of pain from outside. Alistair's expression darkened, and without hesitation, he reached over and pulled Elena down onto the floor of the carriage, shielding her body with his own as something struck the roof above them. "They've hit Nathaniel," he said, referring to the driver, his voice tight with fury and worry in equal measure. "Hold on." What followed was a blur of motion Elena would never fully piece together afterward, no matter how many times she replayed it in her mind. The carriage tore through narrow streets at a reckless speed, nearly tipping twice as it rounded corners meant for far slower traffic. Alistair shouted directions up through the small window to the wounded driver, guiding him toward the wider avenue near the river, where more lanterns burned, and more eyes might discourage their pursuers from continuing the chase. It worked, eventually. As they broke onto the wider street, one of the two riders peeled away, vanishing into a side alley, while the second lingered only a moment longer before following his companion into the darkness, clearly unwilling to risk being seen so openly. The carriage finally rolled to a stop near the edge of the river district, the horses lathered and trembling, the driver slumping forward in his seat, with a wound along his shoulder that Alistair immediately moved to examine. "I'm alive," Nathaniel muttered through gritted teeth as Alistair pressed a folded cloth against the wound. "Barely, but alive. That's more than I expected a moment ago, Your Grace." "You'll live," Alistair said, though his voice carried real relief beneath its calm surface. "We need a physician, quickly." Elena, still shaking from the chase, climbed down from the carriage on unsteady legs, glancing around at the quiet street, half expecting the riders to reappear from the shadows at any moment. "This is because of me," she said quietly. "Because you called me your wife." "This is because of Voss," Alistair corrected firmly, turning to face her once the wound had been bound tightly enough to stop the worst of the bleeding. "He has wanted a reason to strike at me for years. Tonight simply gave him one he could not resist." "Then I should stay away from you," Elena said. "If being near you puts people in danger, then the safest thing is for us to never speak again after tonight." Alistair studied her for a long moment, the lantern light casting shadows across his face, making him look older, more burdened than he had seemed in the bright ballroom hours earlier. I understand why you would think that, he said. But Voss already knows who you are. Distance will not protect you now. Not when he already believes you matter to me. The truth of his words settled over her like a stone in her stomach. She thought of her mother, waiting above the little dress shop with a single candle burning, unaware that danger might already be circling closer than either of them realized. My mother, Elena said suddenly, panic sharpening her voice. If he knows about me, he may know where I live. She's alone there. Alistair did not hesitate. Then we go to her now, and we do not stop moving until she is somewhere safe. They found a second carriage nearby, one belonging to a friend of Alistair's who lived close to the river district, and within minutes they were moving again, this time with 2 armed men, riding alongside for protection. Elena sat rigid with fear the entire journey, imagining every possible danger that might have already found its way to her mother's door. When they finally arrived, the little shop stood dark and quiet, the single candle in the upstairs window now extinguished. Elena's heart nearly stopped at the sight. She always keeps that candle lit until I return, she whispered, fear closing around her throat. Alistair was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, moving toward the shop's front door, with the same controlled urgency he had shown earlier that night. He tried the handle and found it unlocked, though Elena knew her mother always kept it bolted after dark. Stay behind me, he said, drawing his pistol again as he pushed the door open. The inside of the shop was dim, filled with the familiar shapes of dress forms and folded fabric, but silent in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. Elena's heart pounded as she followed close behind Alistair, scanning the shadows for any sign of her mother. Mother? She called out, her voice trembling. Mother, are you here? A soft groan answered from the back room, and Elena rushed forward before Alistair could stop her, finding her mother slumped in a chair near the small stove, a cloth tied loosely around her head where a bruise was already forming. Elena, Margaret Marsh whispered weakly, blinking up at her daughter through pain-glazed eyes. A man came. He said to tell you that the Duke's toys always break eventually, and you would be no different. Elena's blood ran cold as she cradled her mother's face gently, checking the wound with shaking hands. Behind her, Alistair swore under his breath, his earlier calm cracking for the first time that night. He came here himself, Alistair said grimly, kneeling beside them to examine the injury. This is no longer a threat, Elena. This is a promise, and Voss intends to keep it. Why my mother? Elena demanded, tears of anger and fear mixing in her voice. She has nothing to do with any of this. She has never even met you. Because he knows hurting her hurts you, Alistair said quietly. And hurting you, even in this false story I created tonight, is the closest thing to hurting me that he currently has access to. I am so sorry, Elena. I never meant for a careless remark in a ballroom to bring danger to your door. Margaret, despite her pain, managed a weak but knowing look between her daughter and the finely dressed stranger kneeling beside them. The Duke, she murmured. So the whispers in the market this evening were true then. My daughter, wife to a duke. It isn't true, Mother, Elena said quickly, though the words felt strange leaving her mouth after everything that had happened in the last few hours. It was only something said in a moment of chaos. Whether it is true or not, Alistair said, rising to his feet with new determination hardening his features. Voss now believes it completely, and he will not stop until he either proves it false in the cruelest way possible, or forces us to make it true, simply to survive what comes next. Elena looked up at him, still holding her injured mother close, fear and exhaustion warring inside her. What are you saying? I am saying, Alistair replied, his voice steady despite the danger still hanging heavy in the room, that the safest path forward, for you and for your mother both, may be to make the world believe the lie completely, until Voss has no leverage left to use against either of you. I know it is a great deal to ask after everything that has happened tonight, but I believe it may be the only way to keep you both alive. Outside, in the darkened street, one of the armed men stationed near the carriage let out a low whistle of warning, and both Alistair and Elena turned sharply toward the sound, aware that whatever danger had followed them through the city that night had not yet finished circling, and might already be closer than either of them wanted to believe. The armed man's whistle cut through the night like a blade, and for one terrible second, Elena feared the riders had returned. Alistair moved instantly to the window, pistol raised, scanning the dark street beyond the shop's dusty glass. "It's Bennett," he said after a tense pause, lowering the weapon slightly as a familiar figure on horseback approached from the direction of the main road. A friend. He must have heard about the attack on the carriage. Lord Edmund Bennett dismounted quickly, his coat still half-buttoned as though he had dressed in a hurry, his usually easy expression tight with concern. He was younger than Alistair, with sandy hair and a quick, restless energy that seemed to fill the small shop the moment he stepped inside. "Word travels fast when a duke's carriage gets attacked in broad streets near the river district," Bennett said without preamble, his eyes sweeping over the scene, the injured Margaret Marsh still seated near the stove, Elena's pale, frightened face, and finally settling on Alistair with a raised eyebrow. "Care to explain why half the city is already whispering about your secret wife?" "Not now, Edmund," Alistair said, though there was no real anger in it, only exhaustion. "We need a physician for Nathaniel, and this family needs somewhere safer than a shop with an unlocked door facing the street." Bennett's teasing expression vanished instantly, replaced by the same seriousness Elena had glimpsed in Alistair earlier that night. "Voss," he said simply, not a question but a certainty. "I heard he was released from custody months ago, on some technicality regarding evidence. I did not think he would move against you so directly, so soon." "Neither did I," Alistair admitted grimly. "But he has already struck twice tonight, and I do not believe he intends to stop simply because his first attempts failed." Bennett studied Elena for a long moment, something calculating and curious in his gaze, though not unkind. "So this is the young woman half the ballroom is already gossiping about. I confess, I expected someone entirely different when the rumor reached me an hour ago." "Different how?" Elena asked, too tired and frightened to soften the sharp edge in her voice. "Softer, perhaps," Bennett said with the ghost of a smile. "Less likely to still be standing after the night you've clearly had. My apologies, Miss Marsh. I mean no offense. Quite the opposite, in fact." Despite everything, a small, exhausted laugh escaped Elena's lips, the first release of tension she had felt since the candles had gone out in the ballroom hours earlier. "None taken, my lord. It has been an unusual evening. Unusual is a rather generous word for nearly being run down by riders in the dark," Bennett said, turning back to Alistair. "What is the plan then? You cannot simply leave them here undefended." Alistair's gaze moved to Margaret, still pale but steadier now that the initial shock had passed, and then to Elena, who stood protectively close to her mother's chair. "I am taking them to the townhouse tonight," he said. "Both of them. It is the only place I can guarantee proper protection, until we understand exactly how far Voss intends to take this." "Your townhouse?" Elena repeated, startled. "My lord, that is not appropriate. My mother and I cannot simply—" "Appropriate matters very little when your lives are at risk," Alistair interrupted gently but firmly. "I would rather endure whatever gossip follows than read tomorrow's papers reporting that Gareth Voss succeeded where tonight's attack failed." Margaret, despite her pain, reached out and gently touched her daughter's arm. "Elena," she said softly, "sometimes pride must bend to survival. I have lived long enough to know the difference between foolish stubbornness and wisdom." It took nearly an hour to gather what few belongings could be safely packed, Bennett standing guard at the shop's door the entire time, while Alistair arranged for a physician to meet them at the townhouse to properly treat both Margaret's injury and the driver's wound. By the time their small, exhausted group finally arrived at the grand stone townhouse on the quieter side of the city, the sky had begun to lighten faintly at the edges, promising a dawn that felt impossibly far away after everything the night had brought. The townhouse itself was smaller than Elena had expected for a duke, elegant but not overwhelming, filled with warm lamplight and the quiet efficiency of servants who asked no questions, despite the unusual hour and the unusual guests. Margaret was settled into a comfortable guest room, with the physician attending her wound, while Elena found herself standing in a richly furnished sitting room, still wearing her borrowed cloak, feeling entirely out of place among the polished furniture and gilded frames. Alistair joined her there, once he was certain both his driver and Margaret were being properly cared for, closing the door softly behind him to give them privacy. Bennett had remained downstairs, arranging additional guards for the property through the remainder of the night. "You should rest," Alistair said, though he made no move to leave the room himself. "There is a guest chamber prepared for you as well." "How can I rest?" Elena said, finally allowing some of her exhaustion and fear to show plainly on her face. "When a man nearly killed your driver tonight, and struck my mother in her own home, all because of words spoken carelessly in a crowded ballroom." "They were not entirely careless," Alistair admitted quietly, sitting slowly into the chair across from her. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, but how to escape the marriage my family keeps pressing upon me. When I saw you standing there, unimpressed by any of it, something in me simply acted, before thinking it through properly. I am sorry that my impulsiveness has cost your family so dearly tonight." Elena studied him in the lamplight, this man who held enormous power and title, yet seemed genuinely burdened by guilt over what had happened. "Tell me honestly," she said, "this plan you mentioned earlier, about making the lie appear true, is that truly the safest path, or merely the most convenient one for you?" Alistair met her gaze steadily. "I believe it may be both," he said. "Voss struck tonight because he believed hurting you would wound me deeply enough to draw me into a confrontation on his terms. Somewhere he holds the advantage. If our marriage becomes an accepted truth rather than a whispered rumor, if you are seen publicly, protected, embedded within my household with proper guards and standing, he loses the leverage of surprise. He can no longer treat you as merely a passing infatuation to be eliminated quietly. You would become someone the entire city recognizes as under my direct protection." "And if I refuse?" Elena asked. "Then I will still protect you and your mother as best I can," Alistair said without hesitation. "This is not a demand, Elena. I would never force such an arrangement upon you against your will, not after everything you have already endured tonight because of my careless words." Elena rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the tall window overlooking the quiet street below, where 2 guards now stood watch beneath the gaslights. She thought of her mother's small dress shop, the modest life they had built together through years of careful work and quiet dignity, now shattered in a single night by danger neither of them had asked for. "My mother's shop provides everything we have," she said finally, still facing the window. "If I disappear into your household for weeks, perhaps months, who tends to her customers? Who pays the debts that keep the roof above our heads? Whatever expenses arise from this arrangement," Alistair said, "I will cover entirely, and gladly. Your mother's shop, her health, her comfort, all of it will be secured, regardless of how long this arrangement between us needs to continue." Elena turned back to face him, searching his expression for any hint of deception, any sign that his offer carried hidden costs she had not yet considered. She found none, only quiet sincerity, and, beneath it, something that looked remarkably like hope. "And what would this arrangement require of me, exactly?" she asked. "Beyond simply existing under your roof and allowing the city to believe a lie?" "You would need to learn certain things," Alistair admitted. "How to move through society convincingly. How to answer questions that will inevitably come from people far less kind than Bennett. There will be scrutiny, curiosity, perhaps even cruelty, from those who resent seeing a duke's supposed wife rise from humble beginnings. It will not be an easy path, Elena. I would not pretend otherwise." "And when it ends?" Elena pressed. "When Voss is dealt with, or grows tired of his pursuit, what happens to the lie then? Does it simply dissolve, and I return to my old life as though none of this occurred?" For a long moment, Alistair said nothing, and something in his silence told Elena that even he did not know the true answer to that question. "I suppose," he said finally, quietly, "that will depend on what we discover about each other along the way." The weight of his words settled between them, neither entirely comforting nor entirely alarming, but honest in a way that felt more valuable than any easy promise he could have offered instead. Downstairs, a sudden knock echoed through the townhouse, sharp and urgent, followed by the low murmur of Bennett's voice speaking with someone at the front entrance. Moments later, quick footsteps approached the sitting room, and Bennett appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "A messenger just arrived," he said, holding a folded letter sealed with dark wax. No name attached, delivered by a boy who ran the moment it was handed over. "I believe you should see this immediately." Alistair took the letter, breaking the seal with careful, controlled movements, though Elena noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as he unfolded the paper and began to read. Whatever words waited inside, they drained the color from his face within seconds. "What does it say?" Elena asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Alistair looked up slowly, meeting her eyes with an expression she had not yet seen from him that night, something closer to genuine fear. "Voss knows you are here," he said quietly. "And he has given us exactly 3 days before he intends to prove to the entire city that the Duke's wife is nothing more than a fragile lie, one he plans to break in the most public and painful way imaginable." The room fell silent, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall, counting down moments neither of them could afford to waste. 3 days. Elena repeated the words in her mind long after Bennett had left the room to strengthen the guard outside, long after Alistair had folded the letter away, with hands that were not quite steady. 3 days, to become someone she had never been, to convince an entire city of nobles that a lie born from a moment of panic was, in fact, an unshakable truth. "What exactly does he intend to do?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. Alistair handed her the letter without a word, and Elena read the cramped, hurried handwriting herself. The message was short, almost mockingly polite in its phrasing, informing the Duke that his claim of marriage would be tested publicly at the upcoming gathering hosted by Lord Whitmore in 3 days' time, where proof of a legitimate union would be demanded before witnesses of considerable standing. Failure to provide such proof, the letter stated plainly, would result in consequences extending beyond mere embarrassment. "He wants a public trial," Elena said, lowering the letter slowly. "Not just gossip, but an actual demand for proof, in front of everyone who matters in this city." "Yes," Alistair confirmed grimly. "And if we cannot provide something convincing, he will use the failure as justification to escalate matters far beyond threatening letters and staged attacks on the road." Bennett returned to the room then, having overheard enough of the conversation from the hallway to understand the stakes clearly. 3 days is not much time to prepare a convincing performance," he said, "but it is not impossible either. My aunt, Lady Constance, has spent decades navigating every trap this society can construct. If anyone can prepare Miss Marsh quickly, it would be her." "Your aunt agreed to help with something like this?" Alistair asked, surprised. "She has not been asked yet," Bennett admitted with a faint smile. "But I suspect the opportunity to outmaneuver certain tiresome members of the nobility will appeal to her considerably. She has never cared for Voss, nor for the way he speaks of your family's history whenever the subject arises at gatherings." Elena listened to this exchange with a growing sense of unreality, as though she were watching her own life being discussed and rearranged by others, while she stood at its center, unable to fully grasp how quickly everything had shifted. Only hours earlier, she had been mending a torn hem in a quiet back room, her greatest concern whether Lady Whitmore would notice the delay in her gown's delivery. Now she stood in a duke's townhouse, discussing how to convincingly portray herself as his wife within 72 hours, all while a dangerous man threatened her mother's safety. "I need to see my mother," she said suddenly, the weight of everything pressing down at once. "Before anything else happens tonight, I need to know she is truly safe." Alistair nodded immediately, understanding, without needing further explanation. Of course. The physician should have finished treating her wound by now. He led her upstairs himself, leaving Bennett to draft an urgent message to his aunt, requesting her presence first thing in the morning. The guest chamber where Margaret rested was warm and quiet, lit by a single lamp, the physician just finishing his work as they entered. The wound was not as severe as it first appeared, the physician assured them both, packing away his instruments. "She will have a headache for some days, and the bruising will take time to fade. But there is no lasting damage. Rest and quiet are what she needs most now." Margaret, propped against soft pillows, managed a tired but genuine smile as Elena rushed to her bedside. "You look far more frightened than I feel, my dear," she said, reaching for her daughter's hand. "Sit. Tell me what has been decided while I was resting." Elena hesitated, glancing back at Alistair, who remained near the doorway, giving them privacy, while still close enough to reassure them both of his presence. "There is a plan," Elena said carefully. "Though I confess, I am still uncertain whether I have the strength to carry it through properly." She explained everything as gently as she could, The threatening letter, the demand for public proof, the 3 days remaining before Voss intended to expose the marriage as false in the cruelest possible setting. Margaret listened quietly, her expression thoughtful despite her evident exhaustion. "You have always underestimated your own strength, Elena," her mother said finally. "I have watched you manage difficult customers, impossible deadlines, and a household budget that would have broken lesser women, all while still finding time to care for me, when my own health falters. If anyone can convince a room full of nobles of something false, it is you, simply because you have spent your whole life convincing difficult people of far harder truths. But this is different," Elena said. "This requires me to become someone I am not, to move and speak in ways I have never been taught." "Then you will learn," Margaret said simply, "as you have learned everything else in your life, through determination rather than privilege. And you will not be doing it alone, will you?" Her gaze shifted meaningfully toward Alistair in the doorway, and Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the seriousness of the situation. "No," she admitted quietly, "I would not be alone." The following morning arrived with gray skies and the arrival of Lady Constance Bennet, Edmund's formidable aunt, whose sharp eyes assessed Elena from head to toe within moments of entering the townhouse's grand entrance hall. She was an older woman, silver-haired and elegantly dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention without any need for raised voices. "So this is the young woman, causing such delicious chaos among the nobility," Lady Constance said, circling Elena slowly, much like a tailor, assessing fabric before cutting it. "Stand up straight, child. A duchess does not slouch as though apologizing for taking up space in the world." Elena straightened immediately, startled by the directness of the command, and Lady Constance nodded approvingly. "Good. Instinct matters more than you realize in these situations. Now, tell me, what do you know of proper introductions among the peerage?" "Very little, my lady," Elena admitted honestly. "Then we have much work ahead of us, and only 3 days to accomplish it," Lady Constance said briskly, though there was no unkindness in her tone, only brisk efficiency. "Edmund tells me the situation is rather urgent. Gareth Voss has always been a tiresome, bitter man, dragging old grievances into every gathering like a stray dog with a bone no one else wants to see. It would please me greatly to watch his little scheme collapse before an audience he cannot control." Over the following hours, Lady Constance began an intensive education, unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Proper posture, the correct way to hold a teacup without appearing either too rigid or too casual, the subtle art of navigating conversation with people who asked pointed questions, specifically designed to expose ignorance or humble origins. Elena absorbed each lesson with fierce determination, driven by the knowledge that failure would not simply mean embarrassment, but genuine danger, for herself and her mother both. Alistair observed portions of these lessons whenever his own obligations allowed, occasionally offering quiet suggestions, or gentle corrections, that carried none of Lady Constance's brisk severity. During a brief pause in the afternoon, as Elena practiced walking gracefully across the long gallery, with a book balanced atop her head, a lesson Lady Constance insisted built proper posture, Alistair caught her eye and offered an encouraging smile that made the exhausting exercise feel slightly more bearable. "You're doing remarkably well," he said quietly, as Lady Constance stepped away momentarily to consult with a servant about arrangements for the following day's practice session. "I feel like an actress rehearsing lines for a play I never wanted a role in," Elena admitted, carefully balancing the book as she turned at the end of the gallery. "Perhaps," Alistair said, "but even actresses sometimes find, partway through the performance, that the role fits more comfortably than they expected." Elena glanced at him sharply, searching for hidden meaning in his words, but before she could respond, the book slipped from her head, and Alistair caught it deftly, before it struck the polished floor, his hand brushing briefly against hers in the process. The contact, brief as it was, sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the exhausting lessons of the day. "Careful," he murmured, handing the book back to her, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "I should focus," Elena said, though her voice came out softer than she intended, less certain than the words themselves suggested. "Yes," Alistair agreed, though he made no move to step away. "You should." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the gallery windows around them, until Lady Constance's brisk footsteps returned, breaking whatever fragile moment had begun to form between them. "Enough lingering," Lady Constance announced, clearly noting the charged silence between them, with a knowing glint in her sharp eyes. "We have precious little time remaining, and Voss will not delay his little demonstration, simply because two young people find themselves distracted by each other's company. Elena, again, from the beginning of the gallery, if you please." As Elena resumed her practice, forcing her attention back to the exhausting lessons ahead, she could not entirely shake the warmth that lingered from Alistair's brief touch, nor the growing, uncomfortable realization that whatever role she was being trained to perform, some part of her no longer felt entirely like she was only pretending. That evening, as the household settled into a tense quiet following the day's exhausting preparations, a servant discovered a small, folded note tucked beneath the front door, addressed simply to the Duke's bride, in handwriting that matched the earlier threatening letter exactly. Inside, only a single line waited, cold and deliberate. 2 days remain. Choose your next steps carefully, for I am already watching closer than you realize. The note traveled through the household like a spark through dry kindling, and by the time Alistair finished reading it in the dim light of the entrance hall, his expression had hardened into something Elena had not seen from him before, cold and calculating, in a way that made her understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly how dangerous a duke's quiet fury could truly be. "He is already watching closer than we realize," Alistair repeated, folding the note carefully. "That means someone within these walls is passing information to him." "A servant?" Elena asked, horror creeping into her voice at the thought that someone under the same roof, someone who had perhaps brought her tea that very morning, might be reporting her every movement to a man who wished her harm. "Possibly," Alistair said grimly, "or a guard, or a delivery boy who noticed too much and sold what he saw. I will have Bennett quietly investigate every member of staff who has had access to this house in recent days." Lady Constance, who had remained behind after the day's lessons to review some final points of etiquette with Elena, studied the note over Alistair's shoulder with narrowed eyes. "Voss has always preferred manipulation over direct confrontation," she said thoughtfully. "It would not surprise me if he has planted eyes and ears in more households than merely this one. The question is not simply who watches you here, but how much he already knows of your plans for Lord Whitmore's gathering." The weight of that thought settled uncomfortably over the room. If Voss already understood their intended strategy, whatever performance they prepared over the coming 2 days might already be doomed before it began. "We should change our approach," Bennett suggested, entering the hall just in time to hear the tail end of the conversation. "If he expects a demure, carefully rehearsed bride, presenting polished credentials, perhaps we should surprise him instead." "Surprise him how?" Alistair asked. Bennett's expression turned thoughtful, calculating in the way that suggested a plan already forming behind his easy manner. "Voss thrives on catching people unprepared, exposing weakness before an audience. But what if, instead of hiding Elena's humble origins, we simply refuse to hide them at all? What if her strength comes not from pretending to be something she is not, but from openly acknowledging where she began, while demonstrating precisely why that background makes her remarkable rather than shameful?" Lady Constance considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a faint smile touching her lips. "It is unconventional," she admitted, "but unconventional approaches are far harder to prepare defenses against. Voss expects a fragile lie he can shatter with pointed questions about pedigree and family history. He does not expect confidence rooted in honesty instead of deception." Elena listened to this exchange with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. "You want me to simply tell the truth? That I work for a seamstress, that my mother runs a small shop, that none of this grandeur was ever meant for someone like me?" "Not simply tell the truth," Alistair said, turning to face her directly, something like admiration flickering in his gaze. "But own it so completely that no one in that room can find a single crack of shame to exploit. Voss's entire strategy depends on you feeling embarrassed by your origins. If you refuse to give him that reaction, his plan collapses entirely." The idea both terrified and strangely liberated Elena. She thought of all the careful lessons over posture and polite conversation, and wondered whether perhaps the truest performance required no acting at all, only the courage to stand proudly in a room full of people who had spent their whole lives believing themselves superior, simply by birth. "I would need to practice this differently then," she said slowly. "Not learning to hide who I am, but learning to speak of it without flinching." "Precisely," Lady Constance said approvingly. "And I believe, my dear, you already possess more of that courage than you realize. I have watched you these past 2 days. You do not lack strength. You have simply never been given a stage worthy of displaying it." Over the following hours, their preparations shifted entirely. Rather than drilling Elena on which fork belonged to which course, or how deeply to curtsy before a countess, Lady Constance began instead helping her craft careful, confident responses to the kinds of cutting questions Lady Priscilla and her circle were certain to ask. How did a seamstress's assistant come to capture a duke's attention? What value could such humble beginnings possibly bring to an ancient and respected title? Each question, once feared, became instead an opportunity to demonstrate wit and quiet strength rather than something to dread and deflect. As evening settled over the townhouse once more, Alistair found Elena alone in the library, practicing responses under her breath, while flipping absently through a book she was not truly reading. He entered quietly, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You look far more at ease than you did this morning," he observed. Elena looked up, startled from her thoughts. "I suppose owning the truth feels less exhausting than constructing an elaborate lie," she admitted. "Though I confess, some part of me still fears standing before that entire room." "Fear is reasonable," Alistair said, moving to sit across from her. "Anyone facing what you face would feel it. But I have watched you these past days, Elena, and I no longer doubt that you possess exactly what is needed to face Voss and his schemes without flinching." "You have remarkable confidence in someone you met only days ago," Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips despite the tension of the situation. "Perhaps," Alistair said, "though I confess, it does not feel like only days. Strange as it sounds, given everything happening around us, I find myself grateful for the chaos that brought you into my path that evening." The quiet sincerity in his voice made Elena's chest tighten with a feeling she could not quite name, something warmer and more dangerous than mere gratitude toward a man protecting her from threat. Before she could formulate a response, a soft knock interrupted the moment, and a young servant girl entered, carrying a tray of tea that neither of them had requested. "Compliments of the kitchen, my lord," the girl said, setting the tray down with practiced grace. "Lady Constance suggested you both might need refreshment before the evening grows later." Alistair thanked her, and the girl departed with a quiet curtsy, though Elena noticed something faintly odd in the way her eyes lingered a fraction too long on the papers Alistair had left spread across the nearby desk, notes regarding the upcoming gathering and the careful strategy being constructed to counter Voss's threats. "Alistair," Elena said slowly, once the girl had gone. "That servant, has she worked here long?" "A few months, I believe," Alistair said, though something in Elena's tone made him pause and study her expression more closely. "Why do you ask?" "She looked at your papers rather closely, for someone simply delivering tea," Elena said carefully. "It may be nothing. I do not wish to accuse an innocent woman without cause." But Alistair's expression had already shifted, the earlier warmth replaced by sharp, focused concern. He rose immediately and crossed to the desk, checking the arrangement of the papers as though comparing them to how he had left them earlier that day. "These have been moved," he said quietly. "Not significantly, but enough that someone has clearly handled them recently." He called for Bennett immediately, and within the hour, quiet but thorough questioning revealed that the young servant girl had indeed been hired only weeks earlier, with references that, upon closer examination by Bennett's contacts, proved impossible to verify through any legitimate household previously listed. By the time guards moved to question her directly, however, she had already vanished from the townhouse entirely, slipping away through the servants' entrance sometime during the confusion of the evening. "She's gone," Bennett reported grimly, returning to the library where Alistair and Elena waited anxiously. "And she has taken whatever information she gathered from those papers directly to Voss. I would wager everything I own." Alistair's expression darkened further, frustration and worry mixing plainly across his features. "Then he already knows our new strategy, before we have even fully finalized it. He knows we intend to embrace Elena's origins rather than hide them." "Which means," Lady Constance said, entering the room with her usual brisk composure, despite the alarming news. He will now prepare his own countermeasures against a strategy we believed would surprise him. We must think one step further ahead than we already have, and we must do so before tomorrow evening arrives, bringing Lord Whitmore's gathering, and Voss's carefully planned humiliation, directly to our door. Elena stared at the papers on the desk, now compromised, and felt the fragile confidence she had built throughout the day begin to waver under the weight of this new, unexpected setback. 2 days had already become one, and somewhere in the city, Gareth Voss now held information that could unravel every careful plan they had worked so desperately hard to construct. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elena lay awake in the unfamiliar comfort of the guest chamber, staring at the ceiling, while her mind raced through every possible way Voss might use the stolen information against them. By the time dawn arrived, she had barely rested at all, yet found herself dressed and downstairs before the household had fully stirred, drawn by restless energy she could not quiet. She found Alistair already in the study, several candles burned low around him, papers spread across the desk in a manner that suggested he had not slept much either. He looked up as she entered. Dark circles beneath his eyes softened only slightly by the faint warmth of recognition at seeing her. "You should be resting," he said, echoing words she had said to him only days before. "So should you," she replied, taking the seat across from him without invitation. "Have you found a way forward?" Alistair rubbed his eyes tiredly before answering. "Bennett believes Voss will now expect us to double down on embracing your humble origins, since that was the plan the servant girl witnessed, which means he has likely prepared cutting remarks and clever traps designed specifically to turn that strategy against us." "Then we need something he has not prepared for at all," Elena said, leaning forward. "Precisely what Lady Constance suggested at first light this morning," Alistair said, managing a tired smile. "She proposes we do something Voss would never expect from either of us. Rather than you standing alone to face his questions, or hiding behind careful rehearsed answers, we face the room together, openly, addressing the rumor of our marriage directly, rather than allowing him to control the narrative through pointed accusations." "Meaning?" Elena asked. "Meaning," Alistair said, "instead of waiting for Voss to demand proof of our marriage, before an audience eager for scandal, I intend to speak first, openly acknowledging the unusual circumstances of how we met, the danger that has followed since, and inviting the room to judge for themselves, rather than allowing Voss the satisfaction of exposing anything through carefully constructed traps." Elena considered this carefully. "That is a considerable risk. If you speak first, and the room turns against us regardless, we will have handed Voss exactly the humiliation he seeks, without any chance to recover afterward. But I believe honesty, delivered with confidence rather than shame, is harder to attack than careful deception ever could be. Voss has spent years building his reputation on manipulation and hidden schemes. Perhaps it is time someone simply refused to play by those same rules." Before Elena could respond further, a soft knock interrupted them, and Bennett entered looking considerably more awake than either of them felt, carrying a folded newspaper beneath his arm. "You should see this," he said grimly, setting the paper down on the desk between them. Elena's stomach dropped as she read the headline splashed across the society page, a scandalous account of the Duke of Ashford's mysterious new bride, hinting at humble, possibly scandalous origins, and questioning openly whether the marriage was legitimate at all. The article, unsigned but clearly informed by details only someone close to the household could have known, painted Elena as either a desperate social climber or an unwitting pawn in some larger scheme. "Voss wasted no time," Alistair said darkly, scanning the article with visible frustration. "This will have reached every household in the city by breakfast." "Then perhaps this changes nothing about our plan," Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "If the entire city already suspects scandal, then standing before them today, with quiet confidence rather than embarrassment, becomes even more important, not less." Alistair looked up at her, something like renewed respect flickering across his tired features. "You continue to surprise me, Elena Marsh." "I surprise myself as well," she admitted with a faint, weary laugh. "A week ago, I worried only about torn hems and overdue deliveries. Now I find myself preparing to face an entire ballroom of nobles, determined to see me fail." "You will not fail," Alistair said quietly. with such certainty that Elena found herself believing him, despite every reasonable fear still churning inside her. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations, Lady Constance arriving early to review last details of etiquette and composure, while Bennett coordinated additional security measures for the evening's gathering, determined not to allow any repeat of the earlier attacks that had already cost his household a wounded driver and a frightened mother recovering upstairs. In a quiet moment during the afternoon, as Elena stood before a tall mirror, while a seamstress made final adjustments to the gown Alistair had insisted on providing for the evening, deep blue silk that complemented her dark hair beautifully, Lady Priscilla Hartwell arrived unannounced at the townhouse, insisting on a private word with Elena before the evening's events. Alistair had been reluctant to allow the visit at all, but Lady Constance had convinced him that refusing entirely would only feed rumors of weakness or fear. And so Elena found herself alone in the sitting room, facing the elegant, calculating woman who had first challenged her identity in the ballroom days earlier. "You have caused quite a stir, Miss Marsh," Lady Priscilla said, settling gracefully into a chair without waiting for invitation. "Or should I say, Duchess Marsh, though I confess the title still feels rather absurd on my tongue." "I imagine many things about tonight feel absurd to you, my lady," Elena replied evenly, remembering Lady Constance's careful coaching about maintaining composure, regardless of provocation. Priscilla's smile sharpened slightly. "You misunderstand me, dear. I have not come to torment you, whatever you might assume of my intentions. I have come because I believe you deserve to understand exactly what you are stepping into, before tonight destroys whatever remains of your former life entirely." "And what would that be?" Elena asked cautiously. "Gareth Voss does not simply wish to expose a false marriage," Priscilla said, her voice dropping lower, more serious than Elena had yet heard from her. "He wishes to destroy Alistair Rutherford entirely, using whatever tool proves most effective. Tonight, that tool happens to be you. Whether you survive this scandal with your reputation intact matters very little to him, so long as Alistair suffers in the process." "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked, genuinely startled by the unexpected honesty. "I assumed you wished to see this marriage collapse as much as he does." Priscilla's expression flickered with something almost like bitterness, quickly masked behind her usual composed mask. "I wished to marry Alistair for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with securing my family's failing fortunes through advantageous alliance. That ambition does not make me cruel enough to wish physical harm upon an innocent woman, simply caught in the crossfire of old grievances that have nothing to do with her." Elena studied the other woman carefully, uncertain how much of this unexpected honesty to trust. "Then what would you have me do?" "Survive tonight," Priscilla said simply, rising from her chair. "Whatever else happens between you and Alistair, once this danger passes, survive tonight, with your dignity intact, and perhaps we shall discover whether you are worthy of the position you have found yourself thrust into so unexpectedly." She left as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving Elena alone with unsettling new understanding of exactly how high the stakes had become, not merely for herself, but for Alistair as well, whose entire reputation and standing hung precariously in the balance of whatever unfolded within the grand ballroom that evening. As the sun began its slow descent toward evening, Elena stood once more before the tall mirror, now fully dressed in the deep blue gown, her dark hair carefully arranged by Lady Constance's own hand. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, elegant and composed, despite the storm of fear churning beneath the surface. Alistair appeared in the doorway then, dressed in formal black that made him look every inch the powerful duke the city both feared and admired. He stopped short at the sight of her, something unguarded flickering across his expression, before he composed himself once more. "You look remarkable," he said quietly. "I feel like I am about to walk into battle, rather than a ballroom," Elena admitted. "Perhaps you are," Alistair said, crossing the room to stand before her. "But I have watched you these past days, Elena, and I believe with absolute certainty that whatever Voss has prepared, you possess the strength to meet it." He extended his hand, and Elena took it, feeling the same steady warmth she had felt that very first night in the darkened ballroom, when a stranger's grip had guided her safely through chaos she did not yet understand. Now, as they prepared to walk into an even greater storm together, that same steady presence felt like the only certain thing remaining in a night filled with uncertainty. Whatever happens tonight, Alistair said quietly, know that I am grateful beyond words that fate placed you in that ballroom the night the candles went dark. Elena felt her heart tighten at his words, aware that whatever role she had originally agreed to play had long since become something far more complicated, far more real, than either of them had anticipated when this strange arrangement first began. But there was no time to examine that realization further, not with the carriage already waiting outside to carry them toward whatever confrontation awaited within Lord Whitmore's grand ballroom. The Whitmore residence blazed with light as their carriage rolled to a stop before its grand entrance, every window glowing with candlelight, music already drifting faintly from within. Elena's hand tightened around Alistair's arm as they stepped down together, aware of the curious eyes already turning toward them from guests arriving alongside their own carriage. "Steady," Alistair murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Remember, whatever happens tonight, we face it together." The grand entrance hall alone dwarfed anything Elena had witnessed before. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, towering arrangements of white flowers filling the air with sweetness, and portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames along walls draped in deep crimson fabric. She forced herself to walk with the posture Lady Constance had drilled into her over the past days, chin level, shoulders relaxed but confident, betraying none of the nervous energy churning beneath her calm exterior. Word of the scandal had clearly traveled ahead of them, for conversation seemed to quiet in ripples as they passed through the crowd toward the main ballroom, whispers following in their wake like a rising tide. Elena caught fragments of conversation, speculation about her origins, doubtful murmurs questioning the legitimacy of the marriage, and occasional flashes of genuine curiosity from guests who seemed more interested in the unfolding drama than in condemning her outright. "They are watching us like hawks, circling wounded prey," Elena whispered, as they paused near the entrance to the main ballroom. "Let them watch," Alistair replied evenly. "We give them nothing to feast upon, except confidence and truth." Lord Whitmore himself greeted them at the ballroom entrance, an older man with kind eyes despite the awkward tension evident in his forced smile. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly to Alistair before turning to Elena with careful politeness. "And your wife. I confess the city has spoken of little else these past days." "I imagine it has," Alistair said smoothly, offering nothing further to feed the speculation. They moved into the ballroom proper, the orchestra playing a lively tune that seemed almost mockingly cheerful, given the tension thrumming beneath the surface of the gathering. Elena scanned the crowd carefully, searching for the one face she both dreaded and expected to find among the glittering assembly. She found him near the far side of the room, standing with a small group of similarly dressed men, his expression carrying the same cold satisfaction she remembered from their brief, terrifying encounter days earlier. Gareth Voss watched them enter, with the patient confidence of a man who believed victory already secured, his gaze lingering deliberately on Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "He's here," she murmured to Alistair. "I see him," Alistair replied, his jaw tightening slightly despite his otherwise composed exterior. "Do not give him the satisfaction of appearing frightened, Elena. Whatever he intends to say tonight, remember that truth spoken with confidence is far harder to attack than any lie he might construct." They moved through the crowd, exchanging brief pleasantries with various nobles who approached with poorly disguised curiosity, testing the waters with careful questions about their courtship, their wedding, details Elena had rehearsed extensively with Lady Constance over the preceding days. Each question she answered with steady confidence, acknowledging her humble origins openly, rather than hiding from them, watching surprise flicker across the faces of those expecting embarrassment or evasion instead. "You handle their questions remarkably well," Alistair murmured, during a brief pause between conversations, genuine admiration evident in his tone. "I have had considerable practice these past days," Elena replied, though she could not entirely mask the tension still coiled tightly within her chest. It was nearly an hour into the gathering, just as the tension had begun to ease slightly under the rhythm of successfully navigated conversations, when Gareth Voss finally made his move. He approached with deliberate casualness, flanked by two companions Elena did not recognize, his expression carrying the practiced charm of a man about to deliver a carefully rehearsed performance. Your Grace, Voss said smoothly, bowing slightly to Alistair with mocking formality. And the lovely bride the entire city cannot seem to stop discussing. I confess, I have been eager to make proper introduction since I first heard the remarkable news of your sudden marriage. Voss, Alistair said, his voice carrying an edge of cold warning beneath its polite surface. I would have thought recent events between us made further conversation unnecessary. On the contrary, Voss said, his smile widening, I believe recent events have made conversation entirely necessary. After all, a marriage of such sudden and mysterious circumstances deserves proper scrutiny, does it not? Surely a man of your standing would not object to simply providing proof of a legitimate union, to quiet the rather persistent rumors circulating through every household in this city. The music seemed to fade slightly, as nearby guests turned their attention toward the unfolding confrontation, sensing the drama they had gathered to witness finally beginning to unfold before them. Elena felt every eye in the vicinity settling upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to the pointed challenge now hanging in the air between them. I owe you no proof of anything, Voss, Alistair said coldly. Your interest in my marriage extends far beyond mere curiosity, and everyone in this room who has followed our history together understands precisely why. Careful, Your Grace, Voss said, his smile never wavering despite the sharp accusation. Such statements, made publicly, might suggest you have something to hide rather than simply protecting an innocent bride from unwanted scrutiny. Elena felt Alistair's arm tense beneath her hand, and she understood instinctively that whatever careful strategy they had prepared was about to be tested far sooner and far more aggressively than they had anticipated. She thought of Lady Constance's coaching, of the confidence they had worked so hard to cultivate, and forced herself to speak before Alistair could respond further, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Perhaps, Lord Voss, Elena said clearly, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Instead of speaking around the matter with careful implications, you might simply ask whatever question you truly wish answered. I find directness considerably more respectable than whispered insinuation, don't you agree? A ripple of surprise moved through the nearby crowd at her unexpected boldness, and Voss's confident expression flickered, just slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a direct challenge from the woman he had expected to crumble beneath pointed scrutiny. Very well, Voss said, recovering his composure quickly, though something colder had entered his tone now. Since you invite directness, Miss Marsh, or should I say Duchess, let us speak plainly before this entire gathering. Where precisely did this hurried marriage take place? Which clergyman performed the ceremony? What witnesses stood present to confirm its legitimacy? Surely such basic details should not prove difficult for a genuine bride to provide. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, and Elena felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her with crushing intensity. This was the exact trap they had feared. Questions specific enough that no vague, confident deflection could adequately answer them, demanding concrete details about a wedding that had never actually taken place. She glanced quickly at Alistair, searching his expression for guidance, and saw there the same recognition of danger reflected in her own racing thoughts. Whatever answer emerged in the next few seconds would determine not merely their reputations, but potentially their very safety, standing exposed before an audience eager to witness either vindication or catastrophic humiliation. The orchestra had fallen entirely silent now, the musicians themselves drawn into the tension gripping the ballroom, and every eye present waited, breathless, for whatever answer would emerge, to either confirm or shatter the fragile story that had begun with careless words spoken in a darkened ballroom only days before. Alistair stepped forward before Elena could answer, his voice cutting through the tense silence with calm, deliberate authority. The ceremony was small, private, held outside the city at my family's chapel in Ashford, performed by Father Collins, who has served my family for over 20 years. Given recent threats against Elena's safety, threats you yourself are well acquainted with, Voss, we chose discretion over public announcement. I would think a man so eager to discuss legitimate proof might also consider the legitimate danger that necessitated our privacy in the first place. The answer landed with careful precision, specific enough to sound credible, yet framed in a way that subtly turned Voss's own aggression back against him before the watching crowd. Elena kept her expression steady, though her heart hammered wildly beneath her composed exterior, silently grateful that Alistair had clearly prepared such details in advance, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. Voss's confident smile faltered slightly, clearly unprepared for such a specific, deliberate response. "Father Collins, you say," he repeated, his tone still probing despite the visible crack in his earlier certainty. How convenient that a chapel so far removed from the city would provide such privacy for a ceremony no one else can easily verify. Convenient, Alistair agreed evenly, or simply practical, given that a man determined to disrupt any legitimate proceeding might have found ways to interfere had we chosen a more public setting. "Tell me, Voss, why exactly does the private nature of my marriage concern you so deeply?" One might almost suspect personal motivation beyond simple curiosity. The crowd's murmurs shifted subtly, sensing the balance of the confrontation beginning to tilt, and Elena watched something like genuine anger flash across Voss's carefully composed features for the first time that evening. Whatever calm control he had maintained throughout the exchange finally began cracking under the pressure of Alistair's pointed counterattack. "You dare suggest personal motivation," Voss said, his voice rising slightly, losing some of its earlier smooth confidence, "when your own father destroyed my family's fortune through manipulation and false claims regarding land that rightfully belonged to us for generations." "That dispute was settled by law, decades ago," Alistair replied, his voice hardening. "Whatever grievance you carry regarding the past, Voss, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the woman standing beside me tonight, who has done nothing except become an unfortunate target of your ongoing vendetta against my family." The exchange had drawn the attention of nearly the entire ballroom now, guests abandoning pretense of casual conversation entirely to watch the confrontation unfold openly before them. Lord Whitmore himself had appeared near the edge of the gathered crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the scandal unfolding within his own home, yet unable to intervene without appearing to take sides in a dispute involving such prominent guests. "Perhaps," Voss said, his voice suddenly dropping to something colder, more dangerous, "it is time this dispute finally reached its proper conclusion. Then, rather than continuing to hide behind old legal technicalities and convenient marriages, arranged in secret chapels no one can verify." Something in his tone shifted the atmosphere instantly, and Elena felt Alistair's body tense beside her, his hand moving subtly to draw her slightly behind him, as though anticipating danger before it fully materialized. Across the room, she noticed two of the men who had accompanied Voss earlier, beginning to move purposefully through the crowd, positioning themselves near the ballroom's main exits. "Voss," Alistair said, his voice suddenly sharp with warning rather than mere irritation, "whatever you intend to do next, I would advise reconsidering carefully. This room is filled with witnesses of considerable standing." "Witnesses matter very little," Voss said, his composed mask finally slipping away entirely, to reveal the cold fury beneath, "when the man they might report to is no longer alive to press charges." The words had barely left his mouth when chaos erupted through the ballroom. One of Voss's companions produced a blade from beneath his coat, lunging not toward Alistair directly, but toward the space where Elena stood, clearly intending to use her as leverage against the Duke, rather than risk direct confrontation with a man capable of defending himself. Screams erupted through the crowd as guests scrambled backward in panic, and Alistair moved with the same swift, decisive precision Elena had witnessed that very first night in the darkened ballroom, pulling her sharply out of the attacker's reach, while simultaneously driving his elbow hard into the man's jaw, sending him stumbling backward into a nearby table, laden with crystal glasses that shattered across the marble floor. "Get her out of here," Alistair shouted toward Bennett, who had been standing nearby throughout the evening, watching the confrontation with careful attention. Bennett moved instantly, grabbing Elena's arm and pulling her firmly away from the chaos, while guards summoned by Lord Whitmore's own household staff began flooding into the ballroom to restore order. But Voss was not finished. As guards moved to restrain his fallen companion, he lunged forward himself, producing a small pistol from within his coat, aimed not at Alistair directly, but toward Elena as she struggled against Bennett's protective grip, clearly attempting to flee toward safety. "Enough games," Voss shouted, his voice cutting through the panic and confusion filling the ballroom. "If I cannot destroy your reputation through proof and questions, Rutherford, perhaps I shall simply remove the source of your newfound weakness entirely." Time seemed to slow as Elena registered the weapon pointed in her direction, her body frozen with terror despite Bennett's desperate attempt to pull her further from danger. But before Voss could complete whatever violent intention drove him forward, Alistair threw himself directly into the line of fire, positioning his own body between the weapon and Elena, with reckless disregard for his own safety. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space of the ballroom, followed instantly by chaos as guests screamed and scattered, guards finally reaching Voss and wresting the weapon from his grip before he could fire a second time. Elena's world narrowed entirely to the sight of Alistair stumbling backward, his hand pressing instinctively against his shoulder, where dark blood had already begun spreading across the fine fabric of his formal coat. "Alistair!" Elena screamed, tearing free from Bennett's grip despite his protests, rushing forward to catch Alistair as his knees buckled beneath him. "I'm all right," Alistair managed through gritted teeth, though his face had gone pale, his breathing shallow with evident pain. "The shot only grazed me." "Elena, are you hurt? Did he strike you at all?" "No," Elena said, tears streaming freely now as she helped ease him down onto the marble floor, pressing her own hands firmly against the wound to slow the bleeding. "I'm unharmed." "You foolish, reckless man. Why would you do something so dangerous?" "Because I could not bear the thought of losing you," Alistair said quietly, his voice strained with pain, yet carrying absolute sincerity, despite the chaos still swirling around them. Guards finally subduing Voss completely, and dragging him away in restraints, while Lord Whitmore shouted urgently for a physician. Elena stared down at him, tears blurring her vision, as the full weight of his words settled over her, amid the wreckage of shattered glass and scattered guests filling the grand ballroom. Whatever lie had begun this strange, dangerous journey between them, whatever performance they had constructed to survive Voss's schemes, the desperate fear now clutching at her heart as she pressed trembling hands against Alistair's wound, felt entirely, undeniably real. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely, refusing to release her grip on him, even as guards and servants rushed to assist, a physician finally pushing through the chaotic crowd to properly examine the wound. "Whatever happens next. Alistair Rutherford, you are not permitted to leave me now." Somewhere behind them, guards forced Gareth Voss toward the ballroom's grand entrance, his earlier confidence entirely shattered, replaced by the furious, defeated expression of a man whose carefully constructed revenge had finally, spectacularly collapsed. But Elena barely registered his departure, her entire attention consumed by the man bleeding beneath her hands, whose reckless courage had just proven, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how far the lie between them had transformed into something neither of them could any longer deny. The physician worked quickly once he reached Alistair's side, cutting away the ruined fabric of his coat to properly examine the wound while Elena remained kneeling beside him, refusing every gentle suggestion from Bennett and Lady Constance that she step back and allow the professionals room to work. "The bullet only grazed the shoulder," the physician announced after a tense examination, relief evident in his voice. "Painful, certainly, and requiring proper cleaning and stitching, but not life-threatening. You are fortunate, Your Grace. A few inches differently, and this conversation would not be occurring at all." Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that she felt momentarily dizzy, tears she had been fighting to control finally spilling freely down her cheeks. Alistair, despite the evident pain still etched across his features, managed a weak but genuine smile as he reached up to gently brush away one of her tears with his uninjured hand. "You are still trembling," he observed softly. "You were shot protecting me," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Forgive me if composure feels rather difficult to maintain at the moment." Around them, the chaos of the ballroom had begun settling into a more ordered aftermath. Guards had successfully removed Gareth Voss and his remaining companion from the premises, the pistol confiscated as evidence, while Lord Whitmore's household staff worked to calm the shaken guests, still murmuring anxiously throughout the grand room. Lady Priscilla, Elena noticed through her tears, stood near the edge of the gathered crowd, her expression unusually solemn as she watched the scene unfold, none of her earlier calculating coldness visible in her features now. Bennett appeared beside them once the physician finished the initial cleaning of the wound, his own expression grim despite clear relief that the danger had passed without greater tragedy. "Voss has been taken into custody by the city guard," he reported. Attempted murder before dozens of witnesses is not a charge his family's remaining influence can easily dismiss this time. I do not believe he will trouble either of you again, for a very long time, if ever. And his companions? Alistair asked, wincing slightly as the physician began the more painful process of properly stitching the wound. Also detained, Bennett confirmed. Whatever loyalty they held toward Voss's scheme has already begun crumbling under questioning, each eager to distance themselves from the consequences of tonight's failed attack. Relief settled more fully over the gathered group as the reality of their safety finally began sinking in properly. Elena remained close beside Alistair throughout the physician's careful work, her hand never fully releasing his, as though physical contact alone could reassure her that the danger had truly passed. It was nearly an hour later, once Alistair had been properly bandaged and settled comfortably into a private room Lord Whitmore graciously provided within his own estate, that Elena finally found herself alone with him again, the adrenaline of the earlier chaos slowly fading into quiet exhaustion. "You should be resting," she said softly, settling into a chair beside the bed where he had been instructed to remain still for the evening. "I have had quite enough rest forced upon me for one evening," Alistair said, though his tired smile suggested he did not truly mind her continued presence beside him. "Elena, I owe you an explanation, and perhaps an apology as well, for everything this arrangement has cost you these past days." "You owe me no apology," Elena said firmly. "You very nearly gave your life protecting mine tonight. Whatever debts existed between us before this evening, I believe they have been more than settled." "That is not entirely what I meant," Alistair said, shifting slightly against his pillows, despite the evident discomfort the movement caused. "When this began, that first night in the ballroom, I claimed you as my wife, purely as a means of escaping an unwanted conversation, without any true consideration for what such a claim might cost you. Every danger that followed, the attack on my carriage, the harm to your mother, tonight's violence, all of it, traces back to a careless decision I made, without asking your permission. And yet," Elena said quietly, "somewhere between that careless decision and tonight, something changed between us, did it not? Or have I misread everything these past days entirely?" Alistair's gaze softened considerably, something vulnerable replacing the earlier guilt evident in his expression. "You have not misread anything," he admitted. "I confess, Elena, that somewhere during these past days, learning your strength, watching your courage, as you faced impossible challenges with such remarkable grace, the lie we constructed together stopped feeling like a lie at all, at least to me." Elena's heart pounded rapidly at his words, hardly daring to believe what he seemed to be suggesting. "What are you saying precisely?" "I am saying," Alistair continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident beneath it, "that when Voss demanded proof of our marriage tonight, some part of me wished desperately that such proof genuinely existed, rather than merely serving as a convenient fiction to protect us both from his schemes." Tears welled in Elena's eyes once more, though these carried an entirely different weight than her earlier fear and relief. "That first night," she said softly, "when you called me your wife before that entire crowd, I whispered something I never intended for you to hear." "I heard every word," Alistair said gently. "I wish that were true," you said. "I have thought of little else since that moment, wondering whether those words carried more truth than either of us was prepared to admit at the time." "They did," Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper now. "They still do, Alistair. More than I ever expected to feel for a man I met under such strange and dangerous circumstances." Alistair reached for her hand, despite the discomfort evident in the movement, holding it gently within his own uninjured grip. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it is time we consider transforming this arrangement into something entirely real, rather than continuing to hide behind a lie that no longer accurately describes what exists between us." Before Elena could respond fully to the weight of his suggestion, a soft knock interrupted the tender moment, and Lady Priscilla entered the room hesitantly, clearly uncertain of her welcome given the recent chaos and danger. "Forgive the intrusion," she said quietly. "I merely wish to confirm both of you had survived the evening's terrible events relatively unharmed, and to offer whatever assistance I might provide moving forward." "Your concern is appreciated, Lady Priscilla," Alistair said, genuine gratitude evident despite his evident exhaustion. particularly given the history between our families regarding this unfortunate arrangement. Priscilla's expression turned thoughtful, almost apologetic. I confess, watching tonight's events unfold, witnessing your willingness to risk your own life so completely for Miss Marsh's safety, I find myself reconsidering many assumptions I previously held regarding this entire situation. Whatever ambitions I once harbored toward securing my family's fortune through marriage to you, Your Grace, I recognize now that what exists between yourself and Miss Marsh carries a depth I could never have provided through mere convenient alliance. The unexpected grace in her words surprised both Elena and Alistair, and for the first time since their difficult first encounter in the ballroom days earlier, something like genuine warmth passed between the two women. "Thank you, Lady Priscilla," Elena said sincerely. "Your honesty tonight, both regarding Voss's true intentions and now, means more than you likely realize." Priscilla offered a small, genuine smile before departing quietly, leaving Elena and Alistair alone once more, with the weight of everything that had transpired, and everything still left unspoken between them, settling gently into the quiet room. "Elena," Alistair said softly, once they were alone again, "I meant what I said. This arrangement began as necessity, born from danger and careless words spoken in a moment of panic. But somewhere along this difficult journey, it transformed into something I find myself desperately unwilling to release, regardless of whether Voss's threat had ever existed at all." Elena leaned forward, gently pressing her forehead against his uninjured shoulder, allowing herself finally, after days of fear and uncertainty, to simply feel the warmth of safety and genuine affection blooming steadily between them. "Then let us not release it," she whispered. "Let us instead discover together exactly what this arrangement might become, now that the danger which first bound us together has finally, truly passed." Outside the quiet room, the grand ballroom slowly emptied of its shaken guests, the scandal of the evening, already destined to become the talk of the city for weeks to come. But within the small private chamber, far from the chaos and danger that had defined their strange beginning, Elena and Alistair remained quietly together, finally allowing themselves to consider a future neither had expected, yet both now found themselves eager to embrace completely. 3 weeks passed before Alistair's shoulder healed enough to move freely without discomfort, 3 weeks during which the entire city continued discussing the dramatic events at Lord Whitmore's gathering, with unrelenting fascination. What had begun as scandal gradually transformed into something closer to admiration, as details of Gareth Voss's long history of manipulation and violence became public knowledge through the subsequent legal proceedings, painting Elena not as a scandalous social climber, but as an innocent woman who had shown remarkable courage throughout a genuinely dangerous ordeal. Voss himself faced serious charges before the city magistrate, his attempted violence witnessed by dozens of prominent guests, leaving little room for the legal maneuvering his family's remaining influence might once have provided. Within weeks, he was sentenced to lengthy imprisonment, his schemes against the Rutherford family finally, definitively concluded, after years of simmering resentment. Margaret Marsh recovered fully from her injury, her small dress shop flourishing unexpectedly, as curious nobles, intrigued by the dramatic story surrounding her daughter, began seeking out her services personally, eager to claim connection however small, to the remarkable tale that had captivated the entire city. What had once been a modest establishment struggling to remain solvent, transformed steadily into one of the city's most sought-after dressmaking shops, run by a woman whose quiet dignity and skilled craftsmanship finally received the recognition it had always deserved. Elena herself continued her education under Lady Constance's careful guidance, though the lessons now carried an entirely different purpose than the desperate cramming that had once prepared her for a single dangerous evening. She learned slowly and steadily, developing genuine confidence in her new position, not through pretense or performance, but through authentic understanding of the responsibilities and opportunities her unexpected new life provided. On a bright morning in early autumn, exactly 1 month after the dramatic confrontation that had finally ended Voss's dangerous scheme, Alistair found Elena in the same library where they had once practiced her responses for that terrifying evening, though now she simply read quietly for pleasure, a rare peaceful moment amid the ongoing adjustments to her new life. "I have something to ask you," he said, settling into the chair across from her with a nervousness she had rarely witnessed from him throughout their entire acquaintance. Elena set aside her book, studying his expression curiously. "You seem unusually anxious for a man who once faced armed attackers without flinching." "Some challenges prove far more daunting than physical danger," Alistair admitted, reaching into his coat and producing a small velvet box that made Elena's breath catch immediately. "When we first began this arrangement, born from necessity and danger neither of us anticipated, I never expected to find myself genuinely wishing to make our false marriage entirely real. Yet here I am, Elena, more certain of anything in my life than I have ever been of anything before." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, understated compared to the elaborate jewelry Elena had witnessed among the nobility these past weeks, yet somehow perfectly suited to everything she had come to understand about the man kneeling before her. "Elena Marsh," Alistair continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath it. "You entered my life through circumstances neither of us could have predicted, transforming a careless lie into something I now recognize as the truest, most important relationship I have ever known. Will you marry me, not as a performance for society's benefit, not as protection against danger, but simply because I love you completely and cannot imagine my future without you standing beside me?" Tears filled Elena's eyes as she stared at the ring, then at the man offering it, remembering that very first night in the darkened ballroom, the careless words spoken in a moment of panic, and the whispered confession that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, transformed into genuine, undeniable truth. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you, truly and completely, exactly as you have described." He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and Elena felt the weight of everything they had endured together, finally settling into something beautiful and secure, danger and uncertainty replaced entirely by genuine love that had grown steadily from the most unlikely beginning imaginable. Their wedding took place 2 months later, in the very chapel Alistair had once falsely claimed as the site of their secret marriage, though this time the ceremony was entirely real, witnessed by Margaret Marsh, radiant with genuine joy for her daughter's remarkable transformation, and by Bennett and Lady Constance, both of whom had played such crucial roles throughout their difficult journey together. Even Lady Priscilla attended, her earlier ambitions long since transformed into genuine friendship with the woman she had once viewed as a rival. The ceremony itself was small and intimate, exactly as Elena had requested, far removed from the grand spectacle that had defined their public introduction months earlier. As Father Collins pronounced them officially husband and wife, Elena felt none of the fear and uncertainty that had once accompanied every step of their strange journey together. Only quiet, profound happiness, at finally, genuinely becoming everything she had once only pretended to be. That evening, a small gathering celebrated their marriage at the same townhouse where their story had truly begun to unfold, where danger and fear had gradually given way to trust, and eventually, to love neither of them had anticipated discovering through such unlikely circumstances. As the celebration continued around them, Bennett raised his glass with characteristic humor. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford," he announced warmly, "whose marriage began as the most convincing lie this city has ever witnessed, and concluded as the truest love story I have personally had the privilege of observing." Laughter and applause followed his toast, and Elena found herself smiling genuinely at the memory of that first chaotic evening, the darkened ballroom, the careless words that had changed everything, and the whispered confession she never intended anyone to hear. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began departing into the cool autumn night, Alistair found Elena standing quietly, near the same tall window where they had first spoken privately, months earlier, following that dramatic first encounter. "Do you remember?" he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "The very first thing I ever said to you, in that darkened ballroom." "She is my wife," Elena recited, smiling at the memory, despite everything dangerous and difficult that had followed those simple, careless words. "And do you remember your response?" Alistair asked, gently taking her hand. "I wish that were true," Elena whispered, echoing the words that had started everything between them. Alistair smiled warmly, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against the ring, now resting permanently upon her finger. "Well then, Duchess Rutherford," he said softly, It appears your wish has finally, completely come true. Elena leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace surround her completely. The danger and uncertainty of their beginning, now transformed entirely into the steady, genuine love that had grown between them against every reasonable expectation. Outside the window, the autumn stars shone brightly over the quiet city, witness to a story that had begun with chaos and danger, yet concluded exactly as it was always meant to, with two unlikely people finding, against impossible odds, exactly the life and love they had never known they were searching for. And so, what began as a careless jest in a crowded ballroom, a lie born from panic and necessity, transformed steadily through danger, courage, and genuine connection into something neither Elena nor Alistair ever expected to find, a love as real and enduring as any true story ever told, proving that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the truest, most lasting happiness of all.